All right, it's 9:02, so I think we will get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this skill workshop of the Energy Modeling Platform for Europe conference. This workshop today is all about how to set up a scenario for energy system modeling. And me and my colleague Larissa will be giving the workshop, and we'll be together today for about 1.5 hours. I think there will be more people joining, but in view of time, because we have a lot of ground to cover and relatively little time, I think we'll get started. Before I go any further, I need to make a couple of house rules clear. So first of all, be aware that this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear, switch off your cameras. If you don't want your name to be shown in the recording, please change it. The second is, I see that you're all muted, and that's great because that's a little bit of a hygiene, let's say, to run the meeting smoothly, that everybody is muted unless they are speaking. So we planned a lot of Q&A and discussion points throughout our presentation. When you're asking a question or when you are making an observation or participating in a discussion, then please unmute yourself. But except for those cases, keep yourself muted so that we don't have feedback and noises and these sort of things. As I said, we have a few Q&A moments, which are indeed meant to address questions, but also to stimulate some discussion among the audience. So wait for those to ask your questions. You can also post questions in the chat, and Larissa and I will do our best to try to address them in the Q&A moments. The time is limited and there are a lot of participants, so I can anticipate that we won't be able to address all questions. But as a teaser, there will probably be a follow-up to these workshops that we are organizing within this conference this year. There will be a follow-up next year in a summer school, and hopefully we will have a similar session there where there will be more time and more chances to address all questions. So yeah, these were the house rules. Let me see, next slide. This is the rough agenda for today. First of all, we take a few minutes now to welcome everybody, to give the house rules and to have a little introduction. Then we divided the session in two big chunks, separated by a break that will take place around 9:30 or a little bit later. The first chunk is a big part on theory of energy scenario modeling, with embedded a part for Q&A and discussion. And that will be given by Larissa. The second chunk is made of two parts, and we will see how long the second part lasts and whether there is time for the third part or not. But so the second part is meant to be an interactive session where we will do some simple, if you want, stylistic scenario exercises. They will be a little bit interactive. We will use Mentis. Hopefully everything works smoothly. But they are also meant to be a moment of discussion. So I didn't put there a Q&A, but it will be all Q&A in the sense that after each exercise, we will welcome questions and observations and a few points for discussion. Now, depending on how long that lasts, then we have also a third part where we will take a look at some important, let's say, global energy scenarios from the IPCC and the IEA mainly. Also followed by a Q&A, which would also lead us to our final remarks and conclusion of this skill workshop. Now, this is the agenda. These are your two hosts today. So it's me and my colleague Larissa. We both work at TNO. TNO is the Dutch Organization for Applied Research. TNO is a rather big research organization. We not only work on energy at TNO, but we work on a number of research topics, basically covering all the important research topics. So think about health and well-being. We do some work for the military. We do data science, mobility, and energy is one of the big themes TNO is working on. We're working on technology development, and we are working especially in our department, on energy policy, energy modeling, energy economics. The whole philosophy of TNO is to bring academic research a step closer to the real world, a step closer to the industry, a step closer to the policymakers, a step closer to society. So that's a bit what we're doing at TNO in general. Today, we not only represent TNO, but we also represent the Y consortium. Y is a research project funded under the H2020 program of the European Commission, and TNO is a partner in this project. And Y is all about improving the way we model energy, and especially energy demand in energy system models. As a consortium, Y organized this series of skill workshops within the EMP-E conference. And so that's why we have our Y logo there. As you can see, I put our email addresses here, which means that you're welcome to contact us after this presentation in case you have additional questions or in case you want to collaborate. We're always open to that. So feel free to get in touch. Now, well, just a couple of words about myself and Larissa so that you know who you're talking to. We are both energy modeling scientists at TNO Energy Transition. My background is in physics. I come from Italy, but I've been living in the Netherlands for a long time, and I've got my PhD in physics here. And after a brief spell in the industry, I started working as an energy modeling scientist, first at ECN, the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands. Now, this institution no longer exists. It was taken over by TNO in 2018, and so that's where I'm continuing my work since then. With this, I would like to give the word to Larissa. Larissa, please say a few words about yourself, and then you can start your theory part. I will stop sharing my screen, and you can take over sharing if that's fine with you.
Yes, I will share my screen now. Can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So maybe I can also go one step. Step moments. Okay. So good morning. So going one slide before, so I can also introduce myself. So yeah, I'm Larissa. I've been working at TNO for 3 years. So actually, exactly when the migration from ECN to TNO was happening. Yeah, my background is chemical engineering, but I've been working with energy system analysis for, I would say, almost 10 years now. I did my PhD on energy system analysis back in Brazil, spent some time at Imperial College specializing myself on the ×2. And since then, also my work experience has been on energy system analysis, policy advice based on long-term scenarios for energy. And that's what we are going to talk about for more or less 20 minutes from now on. So yeah, so in this first part, we go a bit into the theory before we go to the hands-on session. So I'll be spending like 20 to 25 minutes on the definition of scenarios. I will talk a little bit of the history, and then we discuss on how we deal with it with energy systems modeling. So bear with me. At the end, there will be some Q&A, but I ask you to hold on for a bit and let's discuss in the end. So okay, a bit of history on scenarios for energy and climate. So even a bit before that. So at first, this scenario approach that we also, like in the past, would call like complex systems studies, were used more for defense purposes, like during the war. Can you see my mouse? Just
Yes, we can see it. If you
Okay,
click
good.
down to the left, you also can choose a laser pointer.
Yeah, I think maybe the laser pointer is a bit better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was more used like for defense purposes. So the idea was indeed like trying to think about how your enemy would behave, and then prepare yourself for the different possibilities. But so since then, it was already like an exercise of imagining the future. In the post-war, this approach then will start to be used like in other domains, in organizations, in businesses, also for the purpose of planning ahead. And it makes its way into the environment and climate in the 70s. And here I'd like to mention two important things. First is the Group of Rome. It was like in the 70s, it was like a group of scientists, experts that for the first time posed this strong statement that, okay, resources in the earth are limited. If we keep consuming, if we keep wasting it in the pace that we do it now, we will face very critical problems in a few decades. And it's to today, it's a very relevant and very concrete, very real statement that we deal with. And they did use the scenario exercise to background that statement. So they have worked with a specific environmental model, and they work with 5 variables like economy growth, population, and etc. They changed those variables, so they created a set of different scenarios, and with this study, they background that statement. In the energy domain, and that's when I would say the scenario exercise gained some legitimacy as an important tool for planning. In the first oil shock in '73, due to tensions in the Middle East, there were these price rise on oil, and so Shell claims it that, okay, when that happened, no one was prepared for it, but Shell was. And that's because they were working on with this long-term scenario approach for a few years at that time. And they had already envisioned a possibility that back then was not realistic, that there could be a crisis and prices could skyrocket. So they had already envisioned it, and they had prepared themselves for that. So yeah, and then we go a bit further. Since the 90s, I think we are now very used to the scenario framework to help us understand how climate change will evolve over time, what are the impacts and what are the mitigation options, and that's mainly due to the IPCC work, which hopefully Francesco will have time to talk about in the end of the session. And if we think about today, I mean, scenarios are already used in different organizations, countries, regions to plan ahead. And we talk about it, how we pose the questions we want to answer. We want to answer with the scenarios. But here I challenge you to think, okay, maybe if in five years ago, someone would, in a scenario exercise, someone would say, okay, so let's imagine a future that maybe a pandemics will happen and it will change profoundly how we consume energy, how we move, and our behavior. So maybe 5 years ago, people would say, no, that's too unrealistic. Why would we do that? And then still here we are having to deal with this reality that was like not really foreseen a few years ago. So that's what so that's the challenge nowadays for the scenario exercise. So okay, so now I want to talk a little bit. Yeah, so here I'm going to be a bit more structured on the scenario definitions. So scenarios is the scenario approach is indeed about thinking about the future, so imagining the future. And well, we have to bear in mind that when we do that, there are a few like norms, a few values underlying those scenarios, because, well, it's developed, the concept is made by humans, so there are some subjectivity, so to say, on how we do it. And luckily and fortunately, we also have mathematical tools that help us to quantify that and to put it concretely on paper. But we basically do it for different reasons. So, for example, by imagining the future, then we have a planning tool that will help us to prepare ourselves to the different possibilities ahead. We have some technical background on decisions for businesses, for organizations, decisions for policies in different parts of the world. We also might want to use scenarios to build a consensus, to raise awareness of the consequences of specific actions that we take today, on the consequences like in 5, 10 years from now that maybe now we don't really foresee. And it's also a way to map risks and opportunities of specific actions, specific decisions that we take and that will have an impact in the future. So now we bring the debate closer to us, closer to the energy system analysis. So energy system models are computer models, mathematical models, reflecting the energy system and their characteristics like technology, setups, economics, and etc. And we would think that we use energy system scenarios to get our scenarios, but in fact, the scenario exercise, it starts much before you press the run button of your model. So actually, it starts already when you are thinking about your research question, what you want to answer with your model, and that's because you have many elements impacting your scenario design, your scenario exercise. So of course, there is the expert yourself, your best judgment, your norms and your values on what you imagine the future to be. But as you work with quantitative scenarios, when you want numbers, you actually will need data to feed it, and you need to know where the data is and what the type of data you need. The scenario thinking, how you design it, it will also depend on your model itself. So on the methodology, on the mathematical approach, on whatever you put in there, which technologies, which regions, and how you connect those different technologies and regions, how you design your model. So it's actually it's an interactive process where inputs and outputs, they kind of influence each other in the end. And you might want to frame it in a different way to make sure that you're able to understand what I'm saying. In fact, scenarios can fit scenarios. So if you have here your energy system model tool, from this tool, you have your scenario for your energy system with data on technology diffusion, technology investments, and etc. But in fact, you also need your input data. So you need to imagine, for example, so if you need to provide a demand projection for your energy system model, so to assess the supply options, to optimize the supply options, you need to project how population will grow, how economy will grow in your time horizon. So you need some macroeconomic assumptions, for example. And these inputs can also, here we're talking about numbers, you can definitely have numbers in it, but you might also need some input that is not that easily quantifiable. So for example, if you think about consumer behavior, if you envision a future, for example, where consumers will be more concerned about the environment, hence they will opt to drive less, to not have cars. Then it's a bit more abstract, and it's a bit more a movement between having like this qualitative narrative and taking some time to think about how you put it into numbers. So, and also deciding what is your view on it. So actually all these thinking exercise can also be called scenarios. So projections, storylines. So for example, the IPCC, they developed themselves the shared socio-economic pathways. And these usually are scenarios envisioning how consumer behavior, how growth will evolve over time. And these are actually inputs to their climate, their integrated assessment models that will provide an overview of like the energy system, of land use, and etc. So yeah, so usually we say that scenarios are as good as their data, and it's true, but we do need more when we adopt this approach. And okay, and now I'll try to be a bit more practical on how to build a scenario, and I'll start from the very basics. A scenario is usually a comparison, is always a comparison exercise. So you always need a reference scenario. So the reference is your base case, is the scenario that you compare your other results, your alternative scenarios with. That's as simple as it. Usually we might call a base scenario a business as usual scenario. So a scenario that will assume current technical, economic, and market trends for now and also for the future. So it would, for example, include policies that are already in place today. So we would consider that these policies would remain in the future because they are part of the trend, but it wouldn't include any other policy that is not in place, that is, for example, under debate, or policies that we know that we will need to achieve a specific target. That wouldn't be part of your business as usual scenario. That would be part of your alternative scenario. So in the alternative scenario or scenarios, very commonly you work with more than one alternative scenario. Here you envision different possibilities, policies, energy policies that are not yet in place, but you might find it important that they are in order to achieve a specific goal. That would encompass your alternative scenarios. And in practical terms, so the definition I gave here is quite practical. It would mean varying one or more parameters in your energy system model in relation to the reference case. So for example, if you want to envision ETS system in Europe with a higher carbon price, that would be part of your, that would be an alternative scenario, or a policy where you have a more ambitious goal for renewables, that will be part of your alternative scenario. And well, this figure here, I put it to illustrate a bit what I'm talking about. So that's from IPCC. So it's a figure that shows the observed and expected global temperature change according to many scenarios and to many models. And here, the dark orange line would be your trend. So you'll be your reference scenario reflecting current trends. But in between it, you have many possibilities on how global temperature would evolve, depending not only on the scenario design, but also on the model you use to project it. So, and this is quite exploratory, as we will talk in the next slide. So that's the basic concept behind the scenario exercise. But here I want to be a bit more broader. And the idea here, so all these elements here, they are debatable and they could be even a bit subjective, but the idea here is to give you some tools, some ideas on the possibilities you can have when you design your scenario exercise. So first thing, what's your objective? what's your research question? So actually, your idea with the scenario exercise can be more exploratory. So, okay, you have you want to check what are the different possibilities for your energy system, so to say, in the future. So we have more a forecasting exercise, and you can have like a very wide range of scenarios from more realistic to more abstract ones. And that would be, for example, what IPCC does indeed with this big range of scenarios. Or you can be more a tool for decision support. So here we call it more like a backcasting analysis. So you already have a goal. So for example, for Europe, you want to reach net zero 2050, how we do that? And for that, it might be that you don't need like a broad, comprehensive set of scenarios. You need like one or two scenarios to answer that question. Yeah, also when you think about your set of scenarios, probably part of it, or at least one of it, will be more descriptive, will be like more like a description of your system, of your energy system as it is now. And part of it will be more normative. It will be more like we envision the future. When we scope your scenario, you also, in very practical terms, you also have to think about your time scale and your spatial scale. So for example, time scale wise, if you think about climate change impact, it makes sense that you look like 50, 100 years ahead, because climate change is a somehow a slow process. If you're thinking about like a municipality and what it needs to do to improve insulation measures in houses, then you might want to think something between 5 and 10 years. It's a more down to earth analysis. And also on the spatial scale as well, it depends on the policy you want to assess and etc. It can go all the way from local to global analysis. When you think about how you design your process, and then we define it as more intuitive or more formal, and it could also be something in between it. It could also be a mix of both. So the data you need, it can be more qualitative depending on your research question. So for example, I just mentioned how consumer behavior would change in the future and how it would affect people using vehicles, the mobility, for example. So that's has more to do with the narratives, with the storylines you need to background your scenario. But you probably also need quantitative data, especially on energy system analysis. You definitely need quantitative data. So it's also okay to work somewhere in between these two elements. And in terms of data collection, well, as I said, you need to know where your data is. You can just do some desk research and rely on literature. But what we've been observing today is that you have more and more a participatory approach. So more and more you approach different stakeholders, different experts on a specific field and ask them, well, okay, what do you imagine for the future? And you bring that those insights into your scenario exercise. So for example, here at TNO, we developed some scenarios for the Netherlands to check how the country could reach the climate goals for the climate agreements. And upfront, we did hold a workshop with different experts to get some ideas on how they imagined we could do it. And from there, we defined our main scenarios to assess these questions. But of course, it will always depend on the resources you have available. So if you have like 1 week to do so, it might be that you indeed will only rely on desk research. But then if you have resources enough, you can have a more participatory approach. Then the last part, when you think about the content of your scenario, well, on energy system analysis, I am 100% sure to tell you that scenarios will always be very complex. they need a lot of data, different data, a lot of interaction, etc. But yeah, the level of complexity can change. So, for example, if you want to answer your research question based on a snapshot of the future, so you want to look only at one point in time, then you have a less complex scenario than if you have like a scenario that will show you the evolution over time. Hence, you have more intertemporal interactions, for example. Also, and here, I want to limit the discussion like to the key variables, which we'll talk about later when we get more on the hands-on exercise. Depending on our scenarios, you can have like heterogeneous variables, like different variables that you need to work with to set up a scenario, or they might be similar. They might be just about like technology cost, for example, or they might combine technology costs, climate targets, and technology efficiency. So it also impacts the complexity of your scenario. And here on the level of deviation, again, we discussed about like alternative and conventional scenarios, and it links directly to whether your scenarios are more descriptive or more normative. But basically the idea is that the more distant from the reality your scenario is, probably more abstraction you need to envision it. So maybe you need like more time to explain it. You need to background more in a more robust way, and etc. So that also adds complexity. So when you set up your scenarios, it's important to have these elements in mind so you can come up with a consistent set. Okay, so on the theory, I think, yeah, so that was the last slide. So in the next session, we'll try to put this a bit into practice. But for now, I don't know how much time I've spent talking, but I'm happy to answer some questions if there are. I'll just change the...
Yeah, if there are any questions, sorry, I chip in here. If there are any questions, please raise your hand, and I will call the people in order that I see them appearing in the list. Well, I see no burning questions coming up, so that means everything was very clear, Larissa.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I think the next item on the agenda is a coffee break. If I'm not wrong, I think it. Let me try to share my screen again. Where is it? Yeah, here it is. Let me share my screen. Zoom now. There we go. So basically, we covered the first part, and now we can have a little break, unless there are questions, of course. But I don't see any question coming, so I would say let's all grab a cup of coffee and reconvene here in 10 minutes at 9:45.
Sounds good. Thank you. Good to know that I was quite on time as well.
Yeah, spot on time, Larissa.
That's nice.
All right, see you all back in 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes.
So good morning again, everybody. I think it's time to resume our session. And before I give the floor to Larissa again for the second part, I wanted to mention, because I see in the chat that someone was trying to join the session based on probably old version of the program that stated it would start at 9:30. guess this is because the program was changed, probably, but I wasn't aware that there were programs around that stated the wrong time. So apologies for that. But as we discussed briefly in the chat, the slides will be made available, and probably also the video will be made available at the end of the conference. So you can always get back to the part that you missed. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are our email addresses in the presentation, so feel free to always get in touch in case you would like to discuss something or have more information and so on. Larissa, if that's fine with you, I'll stop sharing. I'll give you back the floor so that you can go on with the second part of the presentation. And just to remind you, the second part will entail an interactive session where we would do some simple scenario exercises. Yeah, please make it interactive. So I do expect people to talk and some comments to appear in the chat or some live discussion to happen. Larissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Yeah, Francesco, I just ask you, because with the presentation mode, I can't really see the chat. So feel free to interrupt me if some comment comes up. So,
yes, I suggest that at the end of every exercise, we take a moment to see if there are questions, either live or from the chat.
Okay, sounds good. So, so yeah, so now we go to the second part. I try to be a bit more practical here on how to build your scenario in an energy system model. First, I will spend 5 to 10 minutes on an example myself, and then we try to become a bit more hands-on. So let me just check why. Yeah, here it is. So yeah, so how to build your scenario in an energy system model. So this is even an old figure from the Times manual. Times is the model generator tool we use for our energy system analysis. But let's keep it simple for now. So that's a very simple representation of your energy system. So it's also easy to see what goes in and inside your model. So you have to provide the model with resource data, with energy prices, assumptions on imports. You have to characterize all those supply and end-use technologies in terms of costs, efficiencies, etc. So I'm pretty sure if it was like a newer figure, maybe there would be like another box here, like for the renewable sources. But let's imagine that all the power sector is here. You also have to provide projections for energy demand for the different sectors. So you have to do it like for mobility, for the built environment, and heating, and etc. And what you have as results are the emission projections, the installed capacities and energy generation, the corresponding costs, and also the technology use also in the end use sectors. So which technologies, for example, will generate steel, and how you will heat your house, and etc. So, okay, so that's your energy system. Let's imagine that this energy system is calibrated to the current trends. So let's imagine that you have your reference scenario. So your base year past trends are fully calibrated. Technology cost evolution and use demands, they are also calibrated towards like considering the reference trends. And what we want to answer is, so what we want to investigate is the impact of emission targets. So it could be, for instance, net zero targets by 2050. And here, like the net zero is specifically for Europe, but I'm not specifying like the region here, just think about the targets. We want to check the impact of this emission target on the energy system and in the power sector. So let's try to think about what are the critical variables here, the key variables that you need to work on, that you need like to change. in order to make that happen on your energy system. And also let's try to think about what you want to check in your results. And just a disclaimer, you probably heard like a very nice cat. I'm sorry, sometimes she gets very active, so apology in advance if she becomes very noisy. So okay, so if you think about like emission targets, you probably already imagine that emissions is the key thing that you need to work on. So you add a constraint, and then your constraint would depend how your emission target is set. So it could be accumulative emissions emission target until from 2020 until 2050. It could be like an annual emission cap, so you have to specify it for every year. It could even be a carbon price. This would depend on how you want to set up, but that's a key variable. Huh? When you want to check your results, so probably you want to look at the whole energy system. So you want to check how is the new mix of energy supply, which technologies are invested more if you compare to which sources are used more if you compare to the reference case. This you can see, for example, checking how the primary energy consumption evolves or the final energy consumption evolves over time, always comparing to your reference case. And you also want to look at your power sector. Huh? Probably you will see less fossil-based power, right? So to illustrate it, I put these nice plots from a paper that Francesco co-authored. That's specifically for Africa. So but the research question was pretty much the same. So they wanted to assess the impact of carbon policies on the African energy system. And here on the left, you see the results for emissions. So you have a reference scenario with increasing emissions, and you have 3 different types of low carbon scenarios. So you have one for tax, one with a cap, and the 2DC, if I'm not mistaken, it's also a cap, but much more stringent, as you see here in the result. So that's the direct impact of your constraint on the energy system. Reduction in your emission profile over time. And that could be, so to say, like your indirect impact, because in order to achieve this, you have to have a different energy mix in your energy system as a whole. So here you see it in the results for primary energy consumption and in your power system. So for example, here you see for the reference case in 2050, so black is coal, yellow is gas, and red is oil. You have, I don't know, 90% of your primary energy consumption based on these fossil sources. And as you add your low carbon targets, either as a tax or as a cap, you do see how it goes down, like to half, even to less than half, giving space for renewables, which is the green bar here. So that would be kind of your indirect effects of your carbon targets on your energy system. And in the power system is the same. Huh? If you also look at the 2050 for the reference case, you have pretty much coal and natural gas without CCS, without carbon capture and storage technologies. And as you add your CO2 targets, they go further down. Here also, I would say, I don't know, also 70, 80%, and they go all the way to, I don't know, 20, 30%. And also with a lot of CCS. So here in the 2DC scenario, pretty much half of the fossil-based sources has the CO2 emissions captured by CCS technologies. So yeah, so that's the main illustration. So now I would like to invite you to, sorry, I forgot about this slide, because then just to summarize, define your set of scenarios. So again, remember your scenario exercise is a comparison exercise. We always need a base case. An alternative scenario will include either a modification or a constraint in one or more key variables. And that will always depend on your research question. And here I'll give you some examples. I'm not gonna go one by one, but the first one is the one that I've just explained. So if you want to assess the impact of CO2 emission targets, your key variable will be the CO2 emissions. So I've also mentioned, yeah, the electric vehicles. So if you want, in the past, in the theory part, so you want to assess the impact of higher adoption of electric vehicles, then you might want to increase the market share of EVs, for example, in your energy system, and see how these extra electricity demand will be met, for example, and so on and so forth. So always think about what you want to assess and the key variables you need to change in order to make this assessment. Okay, so now we'll go to the hands-on exercise. So
sorry, Larissa, before we move on, I just wanted to pause for a moment to ask whether there are any questions on this first example that you presented before we move on to the examples that we will do interactively.
Yep.
So if anybody want to ask something about the last couple of slides, please do so. I don't see any questions, no? But well, here's a question on the chat. I'm just going to read it out. More general question. Are there currently qualitative variables regarding consumer behavior that are used in energy system models? If so, which ones? And how can the uncertainty arising from these variables be managed, especially for long-term scenarios? Example, better data, better methods for quantifying uncertainty, etc. Larissa, do you want to tackle this?
Yes, I can talk yeah, a bit about it. So indeed, like the qualitative, I think we talked about it in the theory part. I talked about also how you nowadays more and more you need qualitative data, and also trying to turn them into quantitative data is also an effort, an exercise that is part of the scenario. So yeah, so regarding uncertainty, because well, first one step before, I think like for the energy system analysis, so for the scope that we have here, our strategy is usually okay. We have like a qualitative variable, so we try to use expert judgment, and we of course we go to the literature, and we try to find a way to put them into numbers. So for example, the example I have given before was about consumer behavior towards mobility. So if maybe in 10 years from now, people will drive less. So energy system model, like times, for example, it wouldn't explicit that directly. So probably we would have to discuss how to reflect this behavior in the final demand. So that would be the exercise. There are other tools that can maybe depict it a bit better. So for example, agent-based modeling. So that's not the scope that we have here in this presentation. But usually there's also like some soft linking approaches that you also can use to make sure that whatever number that you put in an energy system model is robust enough to reflect those more qualitative variables, so to say. One way also, one like simpler way also to reduce uncertainty is just like consider a broader range of scenarios. So you consider one narrative, and then for this narrative, you can consider like 3-4 different scenarios that would tackle this narrative somehow. It's also a simple way to work with to deal with uncertainty.
Yes, thanks, Larissa. I see a hand raised. So Felix, I give you the word. Please unmute yourself, and you can ask your question or make your observation.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. My name is Felix Schreier. I'm from the Potsdam Institute. Yeah, and I wanted to refer to you saying that it's always good to have a baseline scenario to compare your alternative scenario true. And my question would be, what do you think? Is it also possible to do analysis without a baseline scenario and only looking at kind of, let's say, a variety of emission reduction scenarios? Because I think what we increasingly see is that it's, for example, hard to give a baseline scenario in energy developments, because just the situation is changing so fast. So if you have a baseline scenario or a current trend scenario, after 1 or 2 years, it might already be outdated. So I would be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, so usually when I talk about base scenario, what I want to say is that usually the exercise is a comparison exercise. So, but well, I think like most of the times the reference scenario is still reflect current trends, but you can also scope your reference scenario in a way that it's not exactly a business as usual scenario. So you can also do it that way. I think what I want to highlight here is that this scenario approach is it's really meaningful if it's more like a comparison exercise. Because for example, if you talk about, I don't know, carbon prices, and then you have one scenario, then you have like a carbon price of 100. But then what does that mean? But if you have a base case where you have like a carbon price, I don't know, of 20 or of 70, then you have something to compare to know the extent of the impact of your scenario. So that would be my take on it. I don't know if Francesco also wants to
yeah, no, I
anything.
basically agree on that. And I also agree on the observation that the idea of a reference case reflecting current trends is somewhat changing, because the trends are not so robust anymore like they used to be. And in fact, I had a remark exactly on that on one of the slides on the IPCC newest scenarios. So thanks for pointing that out. And I think it's well, it's a valid observation, and it's something that as a community of energy modelers, we also need to reflect on. And the valid point remains that you always need to compare scenarios between each other. Otherwise, the scenario exercise gets a little bit meaningless. I hope that addressed the comment. There are a few more questions that I think is nice to take, Larissa, if you're fine with that, with shifting our agenda a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's okay. I also ask you, Francesco, to because I'm talking a lot, so I'm leaving the time management to you.
Yeah.
So
okay, I'll try to be strict. So
okay.
there was a question on shadow prices. I hope I addressed it in the chat, but basically whether you can have individual shadow prices on your constraints. Typically, yes, but it depends on the specifics of your model. Then there are a few questions that I think are quite interesting. One is a general question whether there is a best practice to identify key variables for a certain type of scenario. Larissa, maybe you want to talk about it, because this relates to the table you put on before, I think.
Yeah, it does. I don't know if maybe
Maybe you can take 30 seconds to say something about this.
Yeah, so is there a best practice? So usually that last slide from the theory is supposed to give you some overview of how you do it, but yeah, I don't know if I can really state that there is a best practice, because usually the key variables will also depend on how you set up your energy system model. And I mean, I can have one energy system model for, I don't know, for Europe, like TNO is developing one energy system model for Europe. It will have a different setup as from the JRC European model. So it might be that if you have, I don't know, a renewable target that you want to apply, depending on how you design your renewable technologies, your power sector in one model and the other, you have to have a different approach. So it's kind of hard to come up with a practice that will apply for all scenarios. I would say that one best practice is indeed always bear in mind how your scenario is designed. And yeah, when you check, when you know your research question, you can maybe already map what are the key things underlying this research question. Like, is it like technology costs? Is it like end use demand? And then you go to your model and inspect how it's set up. And then you set up your strategy on how to implement that scenario in your model. But it really has to do with on how your model is set up as well. That's very important.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I agree. I don't have much to add to that. Another interesting question. So the previous question was from Sebastian Dickler from Research Center in Jülich. The next one is from Christopher Proctor from UTC or University of Rome. Whether you can theoretically place constraints on economic or social indicators like unemployment, inequality within a bigger energy system, energy economy model.
Yeah, I think again that well, broader answer is yes. How you do it depends on your model. So, for example, I can tell, like, for example, in the case of the energy systems model and the work we do here at TNO, if you want to place, if you want to reflect a change in unemployment or inequality, so probably we would have to reflect it in the end-use demand we give as inputs to the model. So probably there will be a whole upstream calculation that we'll do before in our input data, and we would feed it in the model. So if you have like a CGE model, a general equilibrium model that really has these economic indications like explicitly input in your model, then probably you would use a different approach to do so.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that depending indeed on how your model is set up, you can to a certain extent address these type of questions. Typically things like unemployment or inequality are better tackled with a CGE model, but then you also typically miss the level of detail that you need or that you have in energy system models to describe the energy system in detail. Now, what we sometimes do is to soft link a CGE model with an energy system model, so that you can run them iteratively, let's say, where you check the consequences of a constraint, say on unemployment, on the overall energy system, and then you implement these consequences in your energy system model in such a way that you create a consistent set of scenarios. Otherwise, indeed, the approach Larissa was referring to is to beforehand try to understand what the consequences of unemployment would be on the energy system and probably on the demand especially, and construct some scenarios based on that in your energy system model. Then there's a final question from Mahendranath at TU Delft that really relates to that, and he's asking how to appropriately translate storylines to quantitative drivers to input into the energy system models. And at the end of his question, he asks how to tackle a case where the modeling results don't align with the qualitative storyline. So that, well, I would say if you define a storyline and then you run a scenario and you see that the results don't align with your original storyline, then I think you have to start at the beginning again. Sometimes the results from an energy system model can be surprising, can be a bit counterintuitive or unexpected, or even in contrast with assumptions we set out to define our scenario. So in that case, we have to go back and reflect why there is this inconsistency, and come up with a better storyline that aligns with really what we see in the model results. In some cases, but that's I would say the minority of the cases, there might be some mistakes in your models in the way you set up, and that's why there is the inconsistency. But typically, if you did your homework well, the inconsistencies are caused by the fact that you don't understand the system dynamics well enough. And then you have to go back and reflect on what the model results are telling you. I don't know, Larissa, if you want to, if you have any tips on how to appropriately translate storylines into quantitative drivers.
Yeah, I mean, there could be, as I said, so for example, if you have tools that can do it better, for example, I mentioned agent-based models, so you can try to work with an approach that would soft link somehow these models, but then you need to have the resources, you need to have the expertise, and etc. So in a simpler way, we can just again, go to the key variables and make some changes to it and background it with the storyline itself. And usually, if you have a consistent story and a justificative to change, like for example, the cost of a technology in 20 years because you expect that the TRL level of this technology will evolve from, I don't know, 3 to 6, 7 during this time. If you have a good storyline for that, and you can just make that change in your model and construct your scenario. And usually, when I say like a good storyline with a good background, probably you, for example, you've done some desk research that would background the statement. Maybe you've interviewed an expert that is like really knowledgeable of the field. He gave you that information, so on and so forth. So again, it depends on the resources you have to do so. You can do it like with a more simpler approach, or you can become like very sophisticated, like soft linking models, for instance.
All right. Well, thank you all for the question. Nice that there are questions, and that I definitely want to take time to discuss them. So if there are more, please put them in the chat or at the next Q&A moment, raise your hand. I think now we can move on, and we have a couple of interesting exercises that Larissa designed for you, where basically you are going to go through the process that she gave you as an example earlier. And we will use a Mentimeter, right, Larissa, to get this done. And the idea here is also to trigger some debate and some discussion. So please go ahead and be vocal later on.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Francesco. So so now I invite you to do like exactly the sequence of slides that I've shown you before. I invite you to do like this very same exercise, but with a different research question. So now what we want to investigate is how CCS, carbon capture and storage, can support climate targets. And also here again, let's pretend we have our base case, and yeah, I'm also not defining the regional boundary, but let's think about the technology and etc. So I have this Mentimeter code. Maybe some of you are already there. Let me just open the. I think I have to stop the laser pointer, and then I can click on it, and then it's supposed to show up. Voila. So please use that code, and I think you can choose 3 among these options. So choose your key variables. Among these 6, and then maybe we can discuss one by one. I mean, what do you think, what are the key variables you think you should change in order to set up your alternative scenarios? Yeah, okay, I can do it. I'll put the code in the chat. There you go, Antonia. Okay, good. We have 4 people answering. Six people. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there you go. Nice. 19 people. 20. Good. So okay, so again, okay, so I invite you to be also very interactive on that discussion, because yeah, a few things can be a bit debatable on whether we consider or not, but among these 6 options, I have 3 favorite ones, I would say, if I would consider if I would have to choose 3 key variables to make these alternative scenarios. And it's nice to see that most of you agree with me. That's nice. So, okay, so for the fossil-based power plant costs, for example, so there are 2 things there, and then that's a tricky one. First is that, okay, if I want to consider fossil-based power plant costs, then when I talk about CCS, we also talk about bio-based power plants. So I'd have to consider those as well. And well, in the end, any extra additional cost incurring from CCS, either if it's a retrofit in an existing power plant or if it's like a self-standing new power plant with CCS, would come from the CCS unit. So we would actually be more interested in the CCS cost, the CCS unit cost, than on the cost of the power plant itself. But again, if you also like have this information, you could include it. Like it's not like it's not set on stone. But I wouldn't consider this like as key variable for this setup. So okay, for the CO2 emissions, okay, we are talking about climate change targets and how CCS can support it. So it's quite intuitive. So the efficiency of industry processes, again, it's a similar case. So first, for industry processes, not necessarily you can use CCS for all of them. And if you would consider the efficiency or the cost or whatever, you probably would be more concerned about the CCS unit per se than the process itself. So I wouldn't consider this a key variable. Then you come to carbon capture unit costs in power and heat plants. That's definitely key. That would be, I mean, you can also have CCS on industrial processes, but I think we are safe to say that power and heat plants would be the most important ones. That would play like a bigger role on capturing CCS. So it's important that you have the appropriate carbon capture costs set up, and they have defined how the projection will evolve over time, and etc. So it's definitely important. So it's a key variable. And also, when I talk about the potential, I mean there is the capture potential in the power plants in the industry sector, and there's also the storage potential. So you also have to consider if you have underground space enough to storage these the carbon that you're capturing from these processes. So that's definitely key. That's definitely an important element that you have to consider in your scenario. For the energy penalty, that's a good one. I would say that the energy penalty of a CCS retrofit, in the end, it's almost like a result from the model than an input, because when you characterize the CCS unit in your model, you will provide actually the energy consumption of this unit. that combined with the power plant will generate an energy penalty. So that's something that the model calculates itself. But I can understand that it's a tricky one, because indeed energy penalty is quite important. So I would indeed expect that some people would choose for this variable. So okay, so that's what so if I go back to the presentation, so that's what I show here. So indeed, what you want to do, you want to constrain the emissions with your target. You want to review, change your cost assumptions, your potentials for carbon capture and storage in the power sector, for heat generation, and for industry. And when you check your results, you want to see how emissions will change and how CCS will be installed over time and the corresponding costs. And that's indeed what Francesco, again, has investigated in a recent paper he published last year. So here again, an illustration of this exercise. So on the left side, you have the CapEx, the cost assumptions for CCS from different sources in the industry and power. So they have worked with different, so the C scenarios, CHC, CLC are the low carbon scenarios, and you have the reference scenarios. So Francesco combined the carbon targets with different assumptions on costs that you can see here. And the result he had for the electricity system, I'm not going to put, I didn't put all the figures, but if you want to check results also for industry and for heat, you can have a look at the paper. So when you combine those changes in these key variables, these are the results you have for the power sector. So again, you have pretty much all gas installed in the low carbon scenarios in the power sector, gas power plants, they come with CCS, sorry. Coal as well, as you see here, but then it's phased out over time. While in your reference scenario, you still have almost half, I don't know, 40% of your system based on fossil fuel-based sources without CCS. So yeah, so any questions, any comments, any different opinions? Because otherwise we can go to the next exercise.
Yeah, but before we do that, I have an interesting question in the chat that maybe is worth discussing with the rest of the audience. It's not directly related to this example that you gave, but I think it's an interesting point. And I would invite Robbie Morrison to just pose the question out loud, if you don't mind. Otherwise, I can read it if you prefer.
No, I'm here. The question was a bit related to carbon caps. Are there examples of scenarios that exogenously, actively and significantly strand capital, that is, rather than endogenously within the model? That would surely be a controversial storyline.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, but I wanted to make sure I interpret what you mean with strand capital. I want to make sure I interpret it correctly. So can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, the energy system is going to be changing rapidly, and one policy intervention would actually be to actively close types of technologies. In Germany, I guess you've seen it through the nuclear phase out, which has happened twice. But other examples in other modeling projects and other studies, that's where I'm heading.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting if I know that there are a number of modelers in the audience. So if anybody wants to answer on that, that would be really nice. From our side, I can tell you that we did a few years ago a study where we looked at renewable energy finance, and we also posed ourselves the opposite question. So not only what can you do on the finances side to promote the use of renewable energy, but also what if you use financing to actively try to decommission fossil fuel projects? And if you're interested, Robbie, I can send you the reference, and then we use our TMECN model to tackle that question in a stylistic way. But the key parameter we modified there is the weighted average cost of capital for either renewable or fossil-based investments. And maybe that relates a little bit to what you're hinting at. But I would invite anybody from the audience that want to contribute to do so.
Yeah, I can also, but I didn't have it in the top of my head because I've worked on this project before coming to TNO. It's been like 4 years, but I just remember that actually before TNO I was at Vito for a couple of years, and there was a very, like in Belgium, there was this very heated debate about 2 nuclear power plants that were very old, and there was this debate on whether we should phase them out or not. It was like Tihange and Doel, if I remember the name exactly, of those nuclear plants. And then we made a study actually with the National Belgian Energy System Model, and we just like really took those nuclear sources out of the system and checked the impact on the energy system costs. But you mentioned about the controversial storyline. Well, there we had some political background to do this kind of study, because there was a debate and people were actually interested. They wanted to know what the impacts would be. So we had some background, like a political background. There's no word to put it, to make this kind of study. So yeah. So depending on your context, it's possible that you do studies like that.
I think that also hints to a key message that maybe it's hidden between the lines in our workshop today. But that's the fact that the scenario approach with the quantitative tool that reproducibly that consistently can reproduce results also makes you present these topics that might be controversial, like divesting fossil fuels or nuclear, closing down plants and so on, in a more neutral way, in a more objective way. So you can indeed run a scenario that explores, hey, what happens in the national energy system if we close down this and this plant? And it doesn't mean that that makes you step back, let's say, from the political discussion, which is best left with the politicians and with the rest of society. But it does give you more information. It does give you, if your scenarios are well defined and your model is reproducible, it does give you a solid quantitative basis to tackle these difficult topics.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're almost at the end of our presentation. Shall we go at least quickly to do the second exercise you had in mind, Larissa?
Yeah, I was going to ask that. How much time do we have left?
We have 2 minutes.
Okay, so we can do it, just not to lose the Mentimeter link. So I invite you to go again to Mentimeter, because our research question now is about what is the potential growth of geothermal energy in EU, considering current climate goals. So
same code as before?
Yeah. Yeah, I also see that some people already voted, and because, yeah, I'm just going to it was about also 3 answers, tops, and yeah, well, we can keep voting. To be honest, actually, for us to have a look on your views on what you think, but just to briefly update, just to briefly bring this debate here. So of course we are talking about geothermal energy, so we need to know the technical potential in EU, and it's also about knowing in the ground where geothermal energy is available and extractable. So it's definitely important. Electricity and heat demand, it's actually also endogenous from the model. So once the optimization of the model decides for these investments, the electricity and heat demand changes accordingly, and also according to the end use demands. Yeah, infrastructure could be considered, but not really needed. So good that no one voted for that. technology progress of geothermal-based technologies, certainly. Like we want to know the cost evolution, if the TRL level of the under developments will increase over time, and technology progress of heat production from geothermal in residential and service sectors. Yeah, so just to give you an overview, that's okay. I think maybe you have on top of your mind the geothermal like for power production, but you can also have like a small scale in the end use sectors. So one of the things we've done, for example, is indeed reviewing the potential also for the built environment. And cost for heat boilers in the finance sectors, indeed, maybe you could consider it, but that's not a key variable. You can definitely combine gas boilers with geothermal energy, but here your assessment's about geothermal, so you could consider it, but it's not really relevant. So that would be my main intake here. And then just to show you the flow and the illustration. So again, Francesco has worked on, these I was also co-authored, so a study that I was part of as well. So we've done this investigation in the past couple of years. So we had this nice work on identifying geothermal potential, also with the help of the geosciences group within TNO. So we've mapped it, we've incorporated in TMCN in our model. We set up some different assumptions, the combined carbon policy also with different technology cost assumptions for geothermal. And we had different results here. And that's the uptake of electricity and heat based on geothermal for those different scenarios. And you see here, for example, for the heat, you also see the results per sector and how it might evolve, for example, depending on your climate scenario, might have geothermal industry or not, and etc. But indeed, you see like different results depending on your scenario setup. So
I think I have to be very strict now.
Yes.
Because I've been asked to close at 10:30, and we're already a couple of minutes over. Well, let me just say two things. One is that thank you everybody especially for making it a lively discussion. I'm very happy about that, and I don't mind that we have to skip part 3 because I think it's more important to it was more important to tackle the questions and make sure to give the floor to the audience also. Again, the slides will be made available. Our emails are in there, so feel free to contact us. And before we close, I wanted to put on our very last slide because we made this. Well, Larissa actually made this small scheme that sort of summarizes all that we discussed today, and that you can use as a reference if you want to think about the process of setting up a scenario. Now with this, I thank everybody once again, and I'm going to close the session so you can start logging off.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure, and don't hesitate to write us if you have any questions.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.